Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 9th of July 2014. And just after 1 o'clock, welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Don't be confused by our dress today. It's still quite warm, bright and blue sky and sunny in Plymouth, hot in the studio. Mike obviously feeling a little bit chilly, so he's got his blue jumper on as requested. And from the chat box, the weather across the country is pretty variable. So we've got some showers, blustery, grey sunshine. Welcome to the United Kingdom. Well, if you're feeling happy, apparently the tax man is going to sort that problem out pretty quickly.
Yes, so Lynn Homer yesterday morning in front of Andrew Turry's Treasury Select Committee and right across the mainstream press today, there are warnings that HMRC intends to extend to itself the power to invade people's bank accounts if they feel that anyone owes them some money. Of course, there's nothing to worry about here because no matter what they do or whatever mistake they make and whatever mistakes they make, they will, of course, leave you £5,000 across all your bank accounts. So if you've got several bank accounts, they will make sure that across all your bank accounts, you've got £5,000 left. But you don't need to worry if they empty the one that they with the cash for the mortgage repayment.
Yeah.
But it gets better because under questions on the issue, Homer made it clear that should HMRC get these powers, that a debate would follow to discuss other agencies having the same powers, including the likes of Television Licensing, which is a private company, let's remember, and DVLA. Perhaps the debate which should follow is whether Homer should keep her job or not, but that's another question. Homer also said that HMRC was expecting to have access to at least 12 months of bank records so that they could look at spending habits.
Yeah.
That's nice, isn't it? But at least one MP was pretty offended by this, and applause needs to be given to John Thurso. And he said, we are talking here about the ability for one organisation of state to have the unique right to go against the Magna Carta and all other things we've established, and to go in and seize, without judicial process or review, a bank account. But Homer then came back and said that she doesn't think it's against Magna Carta.
Well, she's not going...
So that's all right then, because she doesn't think it's against Magna Carta.
Well, Lynn Homer's unlikely to think that, of course, because she's been fully trained by the political charity Common Purpose. And what has she been trained to believe? Well, acting outside your authority. So... Yes. For anybody who's common purpose trained, of course, that is part of the agenda. It doesn't matter whether you're a policeman or a judge. If you're common purpose trained, you can act outside your silo, act outside your authority, and essentially do as you like. And at least common purpose practices what they preach, because here we are with an excerpt of the famous blacklist. This is where Lynn Homer's common purpose political charity was collecting the data on members of the public who were naughty enough to actually be collecting data on them. So this was a clear breach of the data protection laws. But of course, the Information Commissioner at the time, who was having closed-door meetings with no minutes with representatives of Common Purpose, simply gave them a slight slap on the wrist. So I think Lynn Homer, classic common purpose person, she doesn't care what the law is because she has been reframed to believe she can act outside her personal authority. It's pretty easy stuff, isn't it?
Yes. Well, we were aware of the child abuse inquiry headed up by NSPCC man, what's his name? Peter. Wanless, yes, okay. And of course, there was a second inquiry that had been mentioned, which there was some confusion in the newspapers yesterday about which was going to be the primary inquiry and which was going to be the secondary one. That has now been announced. So Theresa May stood up and she was wondering who she could trust to do the job for the second inquiry, which of course is looking into what happened to the dossiers and how did the various institutions deal with allegations of paedophilia historically. So she was wondering who she could trust to do the job, and of course she decided that Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss is the right person. So this is somebody, of course, that has some history with child abuse inquiry. She headed up the Cleveland child abuse inquiry, and she's also headed up at least one inquiry looking into Church of England abuse as well. And of course, she was also the original coroner on the inquests for Diana and Dodi Fayed. But of course, she had to resign she did resign from that because she was challenged over whether there should be a jury sitting. And when she lost that challenge, she felt she couldn't stay on. But what's really particularly uncomfortable about this, or it should be for her, is that her brother, Lord Havers, he was the very person who was responsible for hiding, or was involved in suppressing the allegations of Geoffrey Dickens MP regarding Sir Peter Hayman, the allegations being that he was a paedophile during the 1980s. So her brother was the Lord Chancellor at the time and
was helping to suppress information outing paedophiles.
Indeed. So who does David Cameron put in charge of this part of the investigation? The sister of the person who was of a person that was involved at the time.
Yeah, I think that's known as a safe pair of hands, Mike. It makes sense once you know which side these people are really on.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because David Cameron has said that he is still confident that Butler Sloss is the right person for the job, and of course he does, since the right person for the job is the person who's going to close the inquiry down, isn't it?
Yeah, well, if we're having a look at Butler Sloss, we'll be coming back to NSPCC in a minute. But let's focus again on Theresa May, because very interesting headline here that paedophiles could be digitising 1970s abuse images to keep victims quiet, says MP. Dr. Philip Lee, a Conservative MP, said photographs of historic child abuse dating from the 1970s could be digitised by abusers to discourage victims coming forward. Now, I found this a bit puzzling, and I sought your advice, and you instantly said to me,
well, this is a threat. This man is making a threat against anybody who may wish to come forward and say that they were abused. He's doing it in a particularly underhand way, perhaps, or sly way. But to me, that is absolutely a threat, because obviously, if there's any suggestion that there are digitized images of stuff that was happening historically, then people may not wish those to emerge. Indeed, so.
Yep. So, safe pair of hands, and we've got a good old Conservative saying, well, you don't want to come forward as a victim because something might be digitised and pop up all over the internet. Well, of course, if Theresa May is choosing safe pairs of hands, let's come back to this gentleman, Peter Wanless. Here he is, the NSPCC independent abuse investigator. Now, we emailed NSPCC yesterday to ask some questions. We didn't get a reply. We chased them again today. And I'm pleased to say we did get a reply, which we will show you a little bit later. But here's the critical thing about this man. He is independent. So in the past, he's worked as a secretary with John Major, a Tory. He's worked as a secretary with Norman Lamont, a Tory. And he's worked with good old Michael, interesting spelling there, don't worry about that, Standards in Education, Michael Portillo, also a Tory. And if that's not enough, well, you can also see that he's worked in the Treasury as head of private finance. I wonder if this also includes private finance for children's services. And he's been a senior civil servant in the Department of Education.
But he was a civil servant, so therefore he was totally independent throughout all this.
Totally independent, and of course totally independent politically, with a small bias towards David Cameron's Conservative Party. Well, this is what we need. A big thank you to the viewer who sent this to us. It was a fantastic analysis of the Dickens dossiers. And many people at the moment simply think that Mr. Brittan was handed one dossier. In fact, there were 5 circulating, 3 which were the Dickens dossiers, and another 2 which came into Leon Brittan from Scotland Yard. So if you want to look at some of this yourself, there's the web address, and it's spotlightonabuse.wordpress.com. So thank you very much to the person who did the original research on this, which has allowed us to put it in a slightly different format. Well, here he is, the man at the centre, Leon Brittan. And of course, what's he been saying? Well, muddle, confusion, incompetence, move along, nothing to see. But what we now know is there was dossier number 1, 20th of August 1983, dossier number 2, which was around about 23rd of November 1983, a third dossier in January 1984, and then we have 2 from Scotland Yard, file 1, 23rd of August approximately, and file 2, 25th of August. Now, where has all this information come from? Well, thanks to that diligent researcher, Spotlight on Abuse, we can show you some of the original newspaper articles. And when you look at these, it becomes obvious how ridiculous it is for Leon Brittan to claim, well, I didn't really remember what was being given to me. Here you are, Scotland Yard sends 2 new reports on the paedophile information exchange to ministers. Let's have a look at what they said. 2 separate reports on the paedophile information exchange, which wants to legalise sex between adults and children, have been prepared for ministers after Scotland Yard's 3rd investigation into the organisation. The first report, prepared by the Yard and sent to Mr. Leon Brittan, will be used by the Home Secretary when he returns from holiday next week and has to decide whether the organisation ought to be banned. Mr. Brittan is likely to reject the demand for a ban. I wonder why. And if we go back to the end of the article, the second report compiled by Scotland Yard is being sent later this week to Sir Thomas Hetherington, the Director of Public Prosecutions. It lists the names of PI members and provides details of the organisation's latest activity. And that is obviously the Guardian report from the 25th of August. Well, if we hop across to the Daily Express, what have we got here? Well, part of the headline, Mr. Dickens, revealed that 8 public figures were on his list of shame, and one of them had been a personal friend. And credit to Mr. Dickens, he said, it doesn't matter this person's a friend. When it comes to protecting children, you have to do what needs to be done. Well, let's have a look at what else it says in this article. The Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Thomas Hetherington, today takes delivery of a file on paedophilia, the distasteful fruit of 2 years' work by Scotland Yard's Obscene Publication Squad. So this is not some bunch of papers. This is the result of 2 years' work by Scotland Yard. The squad's thick file containing the names of the famous, the wealthy, and hundreds of anonymous citizens. And it goes on, 2 years ago, Mr. Dickens defied leading figures in the Tory party by publicly exposing former diplomat and NATO advisor Sir Peter Hayman. Isn't it interesting that Mr. Dickens had to defy leading Tories, people who didn't want dangerous people to be exposed? And let's look at what it says here. At the end of the article, it starts to talk about the fact that Mr. Dickens has fears about his safety because he has dared to start reporting what is happening to children in Britain. Well, the reports went on, so here's more from the Daily Mail. 15 men named in child sex report. It's talking about the Scotland Yard investigation. And then this one interesting because this apparently says that Leon Brittan is pushing for the paedophile report so that he can take action. Well, of course, we know evidence seems to suggest to us at least that he'd be pushing for it in order to make sure there was no action. But press reports on the 25th of November, pretty clear, Palace link in child sex scandal. And what have we got here? Should come up shortly, we hope anyway. There we are, homosexual link between Buckingham Palace and the Sex with Children group Pi was claimed yesterday in a massive dossier of evidence by Tory MP Geoffrey Dickens. The 16-year-old boy told his parents he'd been regularly abused by members of the royal household at the palace. And Mr. Dickens said, I'm concerned the palace could be part of a chain supplying young men to paedophiles and homosexuals in the diplomatic, we believe that is the word, it's difficult to read due to the print, the diplomatic service all over the world. The boys claimed are backed up by similar employees. Again, a little bit difficult to make those words out, but that's what we think is being said in this big article. And if we go to the Times, well, here it is again. MP alleges paedophilia at the palace. And if we come down to this section here, it was a case, allegedly involving Buckingham Palace, of course, of a civil servant receiving 57 indecent photographs involving children. There appears on face value to have been a cover-up, which I want investigating. And that is the words, of course, of that very brave MP, Mr. Dickens, who's tried to get the lid off this. So let's go on. Here's the Daily Mirror, the 19th of January, 1984. And the key bit is Tory MP Dickens yesterday handed the Home Secretary a sensational 50-page dossier on the paedophile information exchange. And even the Huddersfield Daily Examiner also picked up on this, reporting the same information that a 50-page dossier had gone across. Now, why would the state want to cover this up? Well, we can probably go to this headline from the Express. TV chief is named in child sex probe. So it says that there were a number of things that Mr. Dickens had claimed. Police accepting bribes from sex shop owners, religious cults involving young girls, an investigation of a children's home. Well, that couldn't possibly be true. If we look at
Elmhouse.
Pardon?
Elmhouse.
Elmhouse is one, yeah. A youth worker and young boys in his care. And the TV boss, who is alleged to have had sex with a child and who has been seen with known paedophiles. So we just put that up on the screen so that we can see it. And also this article again says that since he started his campaign, Mr. Dickens has suffered continual harassment. Now, could it be that the top TV boss would be somebody connected with the BBC? It's a shame we don't know. But what has the BBC been up to? Well, hot off Jimmy Savile, the BBC has already started a smear campaign to undermine the exposure and the good work that Geoffrey Dickens has done. And here we are, BBC Today programme, the 9th of July 2014, a smirking smear article, basically, to try and undermine what this man has to say, coming from an organisation that clearly covered up the activities of Jimmy Savile. So was it, do we think, a member of the BBC that was named in that Dickens dossier? Well, we jump back to the independence of the NSPCC. And we pointed out yesterday that, of course, NSPCC was involved with the Met Police in the first report on the Savile incident. And we also there pointed out, we better highlight it, bottom right, Childline creator Esther Ranson, close proximity to Jimmy Savile, and there he is wearing an NSPCC T-shirt. Well, we're going to say thank you again to a viewer who sent us this, because it just gets more and more clear that clearly there were links between Jimmy Savile and NSPCC. But they sent us this email this morning. Prior to his 5 years leading the big lottery fund, Peter Wanless was a senior civil servant at the Department for Education, specialising in schools reform. Between 1987 and 1998, Peter worked at the Treasury, operating in a range of roles, including head of private finance policy and as private secretary to 3 cabinet ministers who we've shown earlier, John Major, Norman Lamont and Michael Portillo. We have not run campaigns specifically concerned with exposing paedophile rings, but the NSPCC has long campaigned to protect children from abuse and neglect. Since the creation of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, CEOP, which the NSPCC campaigned for, more than 166 networks of sex offenders have been dismantled. The Full Stop campaign began in 1999 as the NSPCC's way of involving everybody in society with ending cruelty to children. During the YOUT investigation, our role was to take the first contact from those who want to report abuse, often for the first time. We then passed this information to the Met Police and also had a dedicated person embedded in the Met to help with this delicate process. We also offered support and counselling to those involved, and we advised the Met on dealing with vulnerable victims. Saville attended a large number of charity events, including some that raised funds for the NSPCC, which were usually arranged by third parties. Very careful language. He was never employed by the NSPCC or a volunteer for the charity, and he was not one of our ambassadors or celebrity supporters. No one but NSPCC staff has unescorted access to children. The NSPCC helpline received a call in 2008 relating to alleged abuse by Jimmy Saville. We immediately alerted the relevant police force. Until this call was received, the NSPCC had no information that Saville was a paedophile. Following the revelations about his past, we have checked our records and can find nothing to suggest any formal connections between Saville and the NSPCC. It goes on to say, this will become clear later in our programme, Sir Rodney Walker was a vice chairman of the NSPCC full stop appeal and was chair of the sports steering group, which raised 25 million for the campaign. It was his personal decision to purchase the flat, and the flat in question, of course, is Jimmy Saville's flat. So here is the man, Peter Wanless, and it was pointed out to us that he's already had to distance himself from an NSPCC volunteer, Macmillan, who had provided a character reference for Stuart Hall. And Peter has had to come forward pretty quickly to say, well, of course, NSPCC didn't sanction this. But what we've got a clear case of is that NSPCC actually has no idea who its supporters are in contact with. And I would also suggest, therefore, no idea whether they are secure. But of course, he's not interested just in children, because here he is as a panel member. If we can highlight this, Plenary 2, Inspiring Leadership Conference. And Peter Wanless is next to Javid Khan, the chief executive from Barnardo's, and also a lady called Anne Marie Carey, who happens to be a UK government commissioner on social mobility and child poverty. If we have a look at her here, this is the lady in question, and these are some of her responsibilities: supporting the chair and deputy chair by building and maintaining effective working relations. So it's hard to see the distance between Peter Wanless of the NSPCC and the government, but perhaps it's just us. So returning to the flat, here's Jimmy Saville, and of course he lived in a luxury seaside flat that was bought by an anti-child abuse campaigner, and by a remarkable coincidence, it just happened to be this gentleman, Sir Rodney Walker, ex-vice chair of NSPCC.
Just a coincidence.
We'll just pause to allow people to think about this remarkable sequence of events, but I'm sure Theresa May knows exactly what she's doing when it comes to protecting children. So if we jump north of the border, we've pointed out yesterday that we've got similar actions happening in Scotland, the police failing to investigate, the political establishment failing to investigate, documents lost, and child abuse campaigners falsely imprisoned. That's certainly going on in England. But we're interested in this man, Tim Fortescue, because he started to talk out about what was really happening. Before we go to more on him, we'll just put in the light-hearted picture of a train. I believe this was taken in Scotland, but somebody's suggesting that the Flying Scotsman was no more, and somebody in Scotland has been lying, particularly about the incarceration of Robert Greene. Well, why does the establishment need to cover up for paedophiles? Well, it's all here, and it's the Mail that's taken up the cudgel, and they are exposing Westminster's dirt book, where government whips, of course, keep all the dirty little secrets. Well, why do they want to do that? Well, out of the man's own mouth, Tim Fortescue, working in the Heath government, and this is what he has to say. For anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal in which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we can help, and if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can because we would store up brownie points. And if I mean, that sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons, because if we could get a chap out of trouble, then he will do as we ask forevermore.
So blackmail.
So there we are. We have a British government now, clearly the truth coming to the surface that the government is run on blackmail. And as the UK column has constantly pointed out, you can now be an MP and take drugs, have sex with your mistress in Westminster, use rent boys, steal money from your expenses, all of that, no real trouble with the general public. But of course, the abuse of children is still something that the wider public will not tolerate, hence perfect for blackmail. We better just come on to this one here, which of course is, don't forget that it was Tony Blair that closed down Operation Or, the paedophile investigation into the access of paedophile sites. And it was Tony Blair that effectively has blocked release of this information, I believe, for some 70 years. So if you're a Labour supporter beginning to crow that this is all Tories and, of course, the Lib Dems, I'm afraid not. Paedophilia is the game of the elite, whatever the colour of your party. Impressive stuff.
Right, so moving on then. A couple of days ago, the story broke that Facebook was being used as the social media equivalent of the mouse in the maze. And yesterday, The Guardian published this report highlighting DARPA's program to use Twitter for more or less the same purposes. In fact, also attempting to influence people's views over Twitter. And this was a DARPA program called Social Media in Strategic Communication, or SMISC. SMISC, very James Bond sounding.
Smershish.
Yes.
Okay.
The activities of users on Twitter and other social media were recorded and analysed, and of course social media is the way that the establishment is measuring public mood these days. So here's that DARPA program. It's part of the Information Innovation Office, and the program list includes a study into how activists with the Occupy movement use Twitter, as well as a range of research on tracking internet memes, and some about understanding how to influence behaviour. For example, using following and retweeting happens on a range of popular media platforms like Pinterest, Pinterest and Twitter, Kickstarter, Dig, and Reddit, and so on. Now, look. What I really wanted to highlight here is where this stuff all came from, because it came from the Information Awareness Office. This is Admiral John Poindexter's Information Awareness Office, established in January 2002 by DARPA to bring together several DARPA projects focusing on applying surveillance and information technology to track and monitor terrorists and other asymmetric threats, including domestic terrorists, to US national security. And they wanted to achieve what they were calling total information awareness. This was the beginnings of the big data idea, to bring together huge data sets, gathering and storing information on everyone in the United States, including scanning emails, social media, such as it was in those days, credit card records, phone calls, medical records, and a host of other sources, without any requirement for a search warrant. So algorithms were to be developed to analyse this data and look for future crime. This was all funded by Congress, and by the way, they were also looking at biometric surveillance technologies. But the backlash with Congress was such that Congress was forced to remove funding for this in 2003, 1 year later. But the agenda didn't go away. It simply rolled into other programs, and that was revealed by Edward Snowden and others, recently. But it's not just the United States.
Do you want to just comment on that logo? That was the real logo.
Yeah, that was the real logo,
Yeah.
and I don't really think there's much needs to be said about it. It's pretty self-explanatory. They intended to keep their all-seeing eye on everything that was going on the planet, and that's pretty much what they have implemented through the PRISM and other systems. Yes. But it's not just the United States that's into this, because here we've got the Economic and Social Research Council, and it's holding its 6th Economic ESRC Research Methods Festival right now, today. And today's session, this is being held by the National Centre for Research Methods, which forms part of the Economic and Social Research Council strategy to improve the standards of research methods across the UK social science community. And this session today, called Challenges, Opportunities of Using Social Media for Social Science Research. And they say social media is used increasingly in social science research as a source of data, a way to connect with participants with other researchers. These research approaches raise interesting and challenging questions for conventional approaches to research. In this session, leading members of last year's NCRM-funded Network of Methodological Innovation, Blurring the Boundaries, New Social Media, New Social Science, will be talking about case studies from their own experience. This network is a thriving global community of researchers using social media. This session will give you the chance to hear more about the work. So this is, I think, has to be seen within the context of the Behavioural Insights team and this whole use of social media, and to not only spy on what it is people are talking about and try to understand the public mood, but also to try and influence people's behaviour using social media. It's not just in the United States, absolutely embedded within the British establishment as well.
So we've got criminals, we've got liars, cheats, criminals, expense fiddlers in Westminster. We now can clearly see that we've also got the paedophile rings operating through Westminster, and these are the people who are saying, well, we need to change the behaviour of the general public.
But we need to know what everybody in the general public is thinking by following everything that they're doing on the internet, because we're pretty worried that they might be getting too close.
Yeah. So there we are. The good news is, of course, that truth is bubbling up to the surface. We have got to keep it coming up faster and faster, and that means pumping information out. So please don't go quiet. Please don't sit at home wondering and worrying if you send an email somebody's listening. We hope they are, because they need to know the truth. Thousands of young people kept in ignorance in GCHQ and other parts of the monitoring security services. So if you've got the truth out there about what's happening, shout it out, and let's get millions of emails per hour talking about what's really happening. That is the way to get the lid off things. And just to make it absolutely clear, yesterday we said that we wondered if the agenda was to take the lid off the paedophile scandal, to totally discredit British MPs and Westminster, totally discredit Westminster in the public eye. And then the next step would be to say, well, we'll have to allow those nice European MEPs to come and run the country. Now, somebody
run the regions, of course.
Run the regions, exactly, yeah. So somebody mistakenly thought that we thought this was a good idea. And I'd just like to reassure our viewers and listeners that, of course, what we were doing was warning that this is the sort of agenda we see developing. As Britain's MPs are totally discredited, it would be so easy to say, well, we've got a new set of clean MPs, in inverted commas. Let's bring in those members of European Parliament. So we don't want this to happen, of course. Let's get pumping the truth out. See you at the same time tomorrow.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.